Chris Paul, John Stockton, Maurice Cheeks, all great defenders, but none of them have the lowest career defensive rating for a point guard. Who does? Slick Watts. As of 2025, there's 8 players who have recorded multiple seasons with 600 assists and 200 steals. Slick Watts is one of them, and the first player to lead the league in assists and steals in the same season? I think you know. One of the most recognizable players in the NBA throughout the 70s, Slick Watts was a hounding defender and a gambler. If he felt he had any chance to get a steal, he'd go for it, and a lot of times he got it. Then on offense, the lightning-quick guard could penetrate to the hoop at will and find an open man at the last possible second. A Seattle sports legend, Watts' NBA career lasted just 6 seasons, but in that short time, he did some great things and was part of some big moments. And while he had his flaws as a player, he was all hustle all the time, as no matter what he did, he was never satisfied. Let's jog your memory. Donald Earl Watts grew up in Mississippi, playing high school ball in Rolling Fork for Henry Weather High, where Watts was already showing some talent on the hardwood. By his own reports, averaging about 36 points per game, and already sporting the bald head that he would become known for, as it apparently first came about as a popular hairstyle in the South during the 60s, but it became permanent for him in his early teens, after a football injury led to uneven hair growth on his scalp. So to solve the problem, Watts just began shaving it bald, and while he was met with some unfortunate nicknames, it wouldn't be until years down the line when he received the nickname that became more popular than his birth name. Then after graduating in the summer of '69, Watts moved on to Drake University so he could keep playing basketball. But after transcript issues prevented that, Watts was gone, moving on to Grandview Junior College, where he would average 28 points and attain the grades necessary to enroll at Xavier University of Louisiana, the only Catholic HBCU. Known as the Gold Rush, Xavier competed in the NAIA and had been rolling out a good basketball program since the 1930s, even featuring future NBA All-Star Nat Sweetwater Clifton in the early 40s. But in the late 50s, due to financial reasons, they had to discontinue their athletics and wouldn't bring them back until the late 60s. So Watts was joining a recently revived program, coached by Bob Hopkins. The Gold Rush were still finding their footing, but Watts hit the ground running, playing very well for the team. In fact, so well that the sophomore guard would be voted the team's most outstanding player. And Watts wasn't just popular on the court, as off the court he was also doing some modeling in local fashion shows. Going into his junior season, Xavier had added some big freshman talent in future ABA and NBAer Bruce Seals, and the Gold Rush were turning into an NAIA power, thanks in no small part to Watts, as the guard was putting up some big-time scoring performances and leading Xavier to the District 30 championship and the program's first NAIA tournament appearance, as Watts was once again named the team's most outstanding player. Then came Watts' final season, and with plenty of capable talent around him, the 6'1" guard deferred more than ever, as the assists started piling up, and the Gold Rush went on to repeat as District 30 champs, with Watts eventually being named a member of the first annual Black Sports All-Star team, and leaving Xavier of Louisiana with a multitude of records, including being the program's all-time leading scorer. But in the grand scheme of things, Slick Watts was from a small program which got little attention, so the 1973 NBA draft came and went without Watts hearing his name. But luckily for Watts, his head coach Bob Hopkins happened to have a cousin named Bill Russell. Yeah, that Bill Russell. And just a few months earlier, Russell had been named the new head coach of the Seattle Supersonics. So with Hopkins vouching for him, Watts was given an opportunity to try out for Seattle. And with hustle and aggressiveness, Watts made the team, with Russell going as far as to say that Watts was the best looking guard in camp and was embarrassing the more experienced players. The Sonics franchise had yet to make a playoff appearance going into the '74 season, and were coming off of one of their most disappointing seasons ever. But with star forward Spencer Haywood and an up-and-coming guard in Fred Brown, they didn't need more offense. And for Watts, he was barely seeing the floor until he got a chance in early December, and he made sure he didn't waste it. And if you're Slick Watts, trying to earn minutes under a coach known for his defense, the best thing you could probably do is play defense. So that's often how Watts would stay on the court, putting in good work against some of the best guards the NBA had to offer. But Watts' defensive style could be dangerous for both his opponent and his own team. Yet while he could get burnt, his gambles also led to him leading the Sonics in steals. And his offense was still present, giving the Sonics a new speed dimension, with Russell constantly singing the praises of his rookie guard. Watts would rely on his quickness to get by defenders, often finding the open man at the last second on his trips to the hoop, as he also led the Sonics in assists. And while he finished third in Rookie of the Year voting, if it was up to Russell, Watts would have had that award, but he would still get a second-team All-Rookie selection. So people knew who Slick Watts was. And during a time where players wore sweatbands on their wrists, Watts stuck out even more, as he chose to wear one around his head, as without any hair, he needed something to stop the sweat from getting in his eyes, becoming one of the first players to routinely wear the headband. But with 36 wins on the year, it was still no playoffs in Seattle. So Watts ended his rookie season with averages of about 8 points, 5.5 assists, and 2 steals per game. So Watts had earned his spot, and in 1975, he was the first guard and often the first player off the bench for Seattle. The Sonics had added veteran guard Archie Clark and rookie big man Tom Burleson, so Watts saw his scoring take a hit, but he also had more guys to get the ball to, which was exactly what Russell wanted him to do, as he would again lead the team in assists. Then on defense, Watts was a complete thief. Wherever the ball was, Watts was probably nearby with outstretched arms. In fact, Watts had become such a pest on defense that he didn't even have to get his hands on the ball to force a turnover. He just needed to be on the court, as Watts would finish top 5 in the league in steals, with him and Freddie Brown forcing too many turnovers to count. Watts was becoming a player who, love him or hate him, you had to respect him. No matter what he was going through or what injuries he was nursing, he never took his foot off the gas. And while he believed that he had done enough to be a starter, he would never want anything handed to him, and knew that his time would come once it was earned. But for now, Watts was helping keep the Sonics afloat, as they hovered around 500 all season, and their 43-39 record was enough to get the franchise their first ever playoff appearance. And by this point, Watts had done enough, taking over the starting point guard spot late in the year, and still occupying that spot as Seattle entered their first round series with Detroit. And in this series, Watts showed up. After a poor debut, he averaged 15 points and 7 assists across the next 2, which even included 6 steals in Game 2. And after the team split the first 2, Seattle took it in Game 3, the first postseason victory in Sonics franchise history. The Warriors were the next test, and Watts was a good scorer and distributor over the first 3 games. But Seattle had gone down 2-1. Game 4 would see Watts put up his first career postseason double-double to even the series. But after a Game 5 loss, Seattle had to win Game 6 to stay alive, and Watts left it all out there, playing all 48 minutes as he finished with 24 points and 11 assists. But it wasn't enough, as Golden State advanced, and Watts ended year 2 with averages of about 7 points, 6 assists, and 2.5 steals per game. But the following season wouldn't just be good for Watts, it would be historic. In year 3, Watts was a starter from day 1, and after a very hot start to the season, he was given a raise, now making 6 figures annually. And while the money was nice, it only came if Watts performed. But Watts wasn't worried. He had been working all his life and wanted to earn his money. And even if he did hit a slump, he always had his hustle and defense to fall back on. This season would see the best version of a popular and dangerous backcourt with Freddie Brown, as Brown would have the best scoring season of his career after Spencer Haywood had been traded to New York. And it's probably no coincidence that Watts, who was now a team captain after the Haywood trade, would have the best passing season of his career, as his 8.1 assists also happened to be the best in the NBA that season. Yet if the Sonics needed it, Watts could still be the one to win them a game with his scoring. And defensively, Slick was slick, going a mile a minute every second he was on the court, and gambling more than ever. But he was confident. He knew he had quickness and the ability to cover a lot of ground in little time. and it didn't hurt that he had some pretty long arms to get his hands on the ball. A ball which he stole 261 times this season, which is over 3 times per game, meaning not only had Watts set a new single-season record, but he was also the league leader in that category, giving him the distinction of being the first player in NBA history to lead the league in both assists and steals in a season. And for his contributions, he was rewarded. The undrafted guard was first team all-defense, so Watts had become one of the league's most promising young guards. And a huge 8-game win streak in February, which involved some heroics from Watts during that time, helped Seattle turn in another 43-39 record, putting them back in the playoffs, this time to take on Phoenix and their high-scoring guard Paul Westphal. With 4 games down, Watts had been inconsistent, doing his best Jekyll and Hyde impression with an 18-point Game 3, then a goose egg in Game 4, because Phoenix was making sure that Watts had no easy trips to the hoop, and they had taken a 3-1 lead over Seattle. But a double-double from Watts in Game 5 helped keep them alive. Then, similar to last year, Watts saved his best for last, with 24 points, 6 boards, 11 assists, and 3 steals in Game 6. But the game ended in defeat for Seattle, as Watts' career year had seen him average about 13 points, 8 assists, and 3 steals per game. And off the court, Watts had always been one of the most active members of the community among Seattle athletes. And on top of his great season, he was also honored with the J. Walter Kennedy Citizenship Award in '76, as things were really coming together for the soon-to-be 4th-year guard. So it was a make-or-break year for Seattle. 2 straight playoff appearances were progress, but last year's first-round exit was regression. So Russell would try to emphasize a more defensive game plan in '77, and with a backcourt of Watts and Brown, it wasn't a bad idea. And Watts pretty much gave Seattle exactly the same thing as last year, 13 points, while being among the league leaders in assists and steals, becoming the first recorded player in league history with multiple seasons recording at least 600 assists and 200 steals. As there was even talk of Watts making it to the All-Star game, but that wouldn't come to fruition. Then in Seattle, for as much as Watts didn't want to believe it, the truth was the Sonics just weren't that good. Then as the season went on and the wins weren't coming, even the eternal optimist Watts was beginning to lose faith, not only in the team, but also in the front office, as there was some rift between Watts and Sonics management. Watts wanted a new deal. He wasn't looking for a raise, just long-term security, but the Sonics weren't ready to commit to that just yet. And player security wouldn't get any better after Seattle finished with a losing record and missed the playoffs, with Watts' year ending with him averaging about 13 points, 8 assists, and 2.5 steals per game. So Slick Watts wasn't a perfect player. Defensively, he didn't win every gamble, and offensively, he didn't have deep shooting range, and missed more shots than you'd like, both from the floor and the charity stripe. But for whatever reason, Russell had become enamored with him since that first tryout in 1973. But it's not super hard to understand why the greatest defensive player of all time would take a liking to a guy who hustled and played hard defense. But going into the '78 season, Russell stepped down, yet Watts would already have some rapport with his new coach, or in a way old coach, the same coach who had recommended Watts to Russell years earlier, as assistant Bob Hopkins took over. And Hopkins had a lot more talent to juggle, with younger guys like Marvin Webster, Jack Sikma, Gus Williams, and second-year guard Dennis Johnson. And while Watts was still starting, and actually having one of his most efficient shooting seasons, he was also frustrated, as Hopkins' offense slowed everything down and took away Watts' biggest strengths. And as a whole, the Sonics were falling apart, winning just 5 of their first 22 games before Hopkins was let go. So enter Lenny Wilkens, already well known to Sonics fans, as he was a star player and coach for the team shortly before Watts arrived. And immediately, Wilkens decided to bench 2 starters, who had both coincidentally played together under Hopkins back in college, as Watts now found himself on the bench, spending more and more time on the pine with each game, as Watts refused to adjust his game to cater more to Wilkens' preferred playstyle. So Wilkens had no reason to play him, eventually putting the fan favorite on the trading block, and just a couple weeks later, Watts was a member of the New Orleans Jazz. Then in New Orleans, Watts continued to come off the bench, as he was stuck behind the backcourt of Pete Maravich and Gail Goodrich. But he had some endearing moments, like hitting the go-ahead bucket in his first game. Then when Maravich went down for 2 months in late January, Watts saw his minutes fluctuate, and while he took care of the ball and passed well, he was just too unpredictable on both ends of the floor to warrant consistent playing time, especially on the offensive end, where his shooting had dropped to a career-low 38.1% in his final 39 games in New Orleans, as the Jazz won just 39 games and missed the playoffs, with Watts' overall season ending with him averaging about 7.5 points, 4 rebounds, and 1.5 steals per game. But now Watts had seen his value diminish. He could be a good energy guy, but no one was looking to have Slick Watts man their offense. Yet Houston would trade for him to back up their star point guard and one of Watts' favorite players in Calvin Murphy. Yet in Houston, he would get even less playing time. But he didn't mind it if the team was winning, as they would finish with a 47-35 record and would take on Atlanta in round 1. But Watts' championship dreams were over quick after the Rockets were swept, as Watts' season ended with him averaging about 3.5 points, 4 assists, and a steal per game. And the Sonics won the title in '79, about 18 months after Watts played his last game with them. And as Watts had kept living in Seattle, he was treated like a champion anyways. But overall, he was waived by the Rockets after the season. Then after sitting out a year, he wanted back in the league, but it just wasn't in the cards, as his NBA career was over after 6 seasons, and he ended his playing career after a brief CBA stint. Post-playing days, Watts unsurprisingly remained among his community, spending decades teaching physical education at multiple schools, and would even be the gym teacher to a young Jason Terry, as Watts became the inspiration for the headband that Terry wore. And Slick's own son Donald would go on to play college ball for the Washington Huskies. And while he's seen his health decline in more recent years, Slick Watts will be chanting "Bring back our Sonics" till his final day. Slick Watts isn't a Hall of Famer. He was never even an All-Star. But it's guys like him who deserve more appreciation. He made the most of every opportunity he got, never taking anything for granted. He was Mr. Cool to the fans and media. But on the court, his play was the furthest thing from calm. But that's why fans fell in love with him. He played every game like it was his last, and put up some pretty big numbers while doing so. A great passer who took care of the ball, yet prevented everyone he guarded from doing the same. All he was missing was a consistent jump shot. A true Sonics legend, Slick Watts lived by one commandment on the basketball court: "Thou shalt not steal," except on defense. But that's it for today's episode on Slick Watts. Hope you enjoyed it, and make sure to subscribe for more videos like this one. If you liked it, check out this one on one of his Seattle teammates, or this one on the player he inspired to wear a headband. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.